In this edition of Generations, we talk to Dr. Robert Elder of Yale School of Medicine about congenital heart defects, what they are and how they're treated. Diane Weaver-Dunn joins us from CRIS Radio to tell us about their services and what else they're doing in the audio space. And Judy Jenks from seniorcenterct.org talks about reflections of who we used to be. Hello, I'm Brian Scott Smith and welcome to Generations, a new podcast for people of your generation. Congenital heart defects, it's not something you hear discussed every day, and you might be surprised to learn that it affects almost 1 in every 100 of us. I went down to Yale School of Medicine in New Haven to talk to Dr. Robert Elder, who's one of the region's top medical experts in this area of medicine. Dr. Elder, thanks for joining us on Generations.
Thanks, Brian, for having me.
So, congenital heart defects, disease, big field. What, at the root of it, is a congenital heart defect?
So congenital heart defect is a heart problem that someone is born with. And it can be a wide spectrum of different problems. It could be something quite simple, like a bicuspid aortic valve, a valve that has 2 leaflets instead of 3. Or it could be something very complicated, like a part of the heart is malformed and they're missing a significant part of the heart. And there's a whole spectrum of everything in between there.
So how prevalent is it? I mean, in numbers, what are we talking, 1 in 50? Can you give us a sense of how many people are born with congenital heart defects?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and most people don't realize how prevalent it is. It's actually the most common birth defect, and the prevalence is about 1 in 100. So to give you a sense of that, it's about 50 times more common than childhood cancer. And the reason that it's important and the reason that I have a job is because as a community of people taking care of children who are born with heart problems, we've done such a good job that by far and away the vast majority of those individuals survive well into adulthood. And not only survive but thrive into adulthood. But they need a doctor in their adult life who knows about their unique heart condition that they were born with.
We're going to get onto that in a minute because obviously it's a very interesting history, this particular field. Let's take it back a little bit because, as you said, many people now who are born with this condition have, modern medicine to correct this and lead spectacularly to normal lives. But that wasn't always the case, was it?
It wasn't always the case, and things have rapidly evolved in the last 50 or 60 years. And so in some cases, heart conditions that would have been fatal now are very treatable, but it does require a lifelong care. And one of the really interesting things for me is to be a student of history and be able to talk to my patients about their history. And actually one of the wonderful things is this is a major center that takes care of patients and has a history. And so some of the early pioneering surgical procedures were done here as early as the 1940s. So there is a long history of congenital heart disease even in Connecticut here.
Tell us a little bit more, obviously, about the work that has developed, because like we said, medicine continues to move on, it improves, it extends people's lives. But give us a sense of your particular field.
Yeah, so I think one of the best paradigms for this is a condition called tetralogy of Fallot, which is the most common cyanotic or blue baby form of heart disease. And if you were born with this condition in the early 1900s, essentially it was a death sentence and you wouldn't live into adulthood. And starting in the mid-1940s, there was a procedure that revolutionized treatment that basically allowed for some blood flow to get to the lungs to pick up oxygen and really was a miraculous treatment, something called the Blalock-Taussig shunt, which was originated from Johns Hopkins in 1944 and then came to Connecticut in 1947. And from there, much of the field of congenital heart disease evolved. And so over time, we were able to not only do these more palliative repairs, but do a complete repair. And then as the field has matured and progressed, we've moved into the era where now we can do these surgeries even on babies, even a day or 2 old baby. And so really have had this remarkable change in the progression of this disease so that when I have a patient now who's born with tetralogy of Fallot, I can say, your chance of doing well over a long term is really good. And I often use the example of someone like Shaun White, the Olympic gold medal snowboarder, who was born with tetralogy of Fallot and obviously is doing very well, is out there winning Olympic gold medal. So I can say to my patients, you could go be a gold medal Olympian.
Which is amazing.
Amazing.
Again, because it just goes to show that with the advancement of modern medicine, people like yourselves and teams of doctors, that, as I say, people can lead extraordinary and normal lives as well, which they wouldn't have necessarily been able to have done 40, 50 years ago.
That's absolutely right. And I think that's a really encouraging thing. I think the pitfall or the challenge is to say that a surgical repair does not equal a cure. And those patients always have to pay attention to the fact that they have a heart that is a little bit different than someone else, and they may be at risk for problems as they get older.
Does the medical profession know why people are born with a congenital heart defect?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We are just starting to scratch the surface of the cause of this, and much of it comes down to genetics. But it's not, in the most cases, a simple genetic thing. Like a condition like cystic fibrosis or Huntington's disease, those are relatively well-described, simple, one gene, one problem. Whereas congenital heart disease probably is a much more complicated genetic phenomenon that involves multiple genes. And most of the families that I take care of who have a member of their family with congenital heart disease don't have anyone else in the family that has it. But when we drill down and start to look more, it probably does have a genetic basis in most causes.
I've noticed you're using the word disease and I'm using the word defect. So am I using the wrong word?
I think you could use either interchangeably.
So let's talk about, obviously, the care people get. They're born, obviously, with these conditions. As you say, medical teams swoop in to correct. But then, of course, their aftercare is then lifelong, but with a paediatrician for most cases. So talk to us about that, because that's an interesting difference.
Yeah, so in many cases, because there was no one else, and because this was a new field, the pediatric cardiologist stepped up and said, well, I'll continue to follow you because you have nowhere else to go. And in many cases, patients with complicated heart problems went to an adult cardiologist who said, I really have no idea what your heart problem is or what kind of surgeries you had. And so within the last 20 or 30 years, as the survival has improved greatly, the field that I specialize in, which is taking care of adults with congenital heart disease, has really been born and has matured. And so what began as a small group of people who are interested has now grown to about 300 or so physicians in the United States who specialize in this condition, who have expertise in this condition, even to the point where there are now specific credentials, board certifications for people that are interested in this. And many of the people are like myself who have training in internal medicine in addition to pediatrics, and some of them only exclusively have training in adult internal medicine because that's what they're doing. That's their bread and butter, is taking care of adults who were born with heart problems.
Why is it that we don't seem to hear as much about congenital heart defects and disease as we do in many other things? Because clearly, as you've pointed out, it is huge.
Yeah, I wonder about that a lot, too. I think it has something to do with the fact that it comes in so many different varieties and that for the most part, it's hidden. So we talked about at the beginning that there's a spectrum, and there's some people that have a very simple defect that may do very well, and there's some people that have really complicated defects. But in many cases, it's hidden. Like if you think about a child who has childhood cancer and they undergo chemotherapy and they lose their hair, it's a very obvious thing. For many of our patients, they may have a scar on their chest, but you may not notice that, or they may not want to advertise that. And in some cases, as people have begun to try to get people to advocate more for these individuals, they said, let's be proud of the fact that you had congenital heart disease. Let's raise awareness about it. And there's a campaign called Rock Your Scar, for example, that has talked about you should be proud of the fact that you were born and had congenital heart disease, and you should let people know that this is an important condition and that most people don't realize how common it is and the fact that you're not alone.
And obviously your patients, it is a lifelong, condition. As you say, they're born with it. So are they particularly interested? Are they very knowledgeable? I mean, because this is the problem, isn't it, with the internet age, is that we're all quick to go and diagnose or find information on the internet. And I'm sure doctors like yourself, roll your eyes like, oh, my gosh. But because this is a different type of situation, are they that more not just interested but informed about the whole situation?
Some are and some are not. It's a whole range. And I think for a lot of people, they, in some cases, want to forget what happened as a child. Many of my patients have had surgery as children. They grow up, they want to live their lives, they want to get married and have families and get jobs and move and do all the things that adults want to do. and that they're only brought back to medical care in some cases when a problem happens. They get a heart rhythm issue for the first time. They have a complicated pregnancy related to their heart issue. They have some complication of their early surgery, and that's what brings them back into care. And in many cases, they say, oh, I didn't really know that I needed to follow up. But one of the big pushes in my field is to help individuals transition to adulthood and to stay in care with someone who understands about those heart problems. Because if we can identify those problems early, in many cases we could intervene and prevent, or at least limit the problems that may develop. And there are actually guidelines out there through the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, that say if you have any form of significant heart disease, you should be being seen on a regular basis by a doctor who knows what they're doing with congenital heart disease. The other flip side of the coin that we should talk about is that there is a minority of patients that were born with a heart problem but don't recognize it until adulthood. So I'll give you an example. So some of my patients have a hole, an atrial septal defect in the top chambers of their heart. And they went about their childhood and didn't have any problems, but as a young adult, they started to develop problems like palpitations, fast heart rate, heart rhythm issues, trouble going up steps. And then for the first time, they're diagnosed with a problem that we say, oh, by the way, this is something that you were born with. So there is a smaller subset of people like that as well.
What would you like to see happen as this field continues to progress and so like awareness, basically? I mean, by the time this actually comes out, there would have been an actual congenital heart awareness a week earlier in 2019, which is a great thing, an awareness campaign. But is that enough?
I think it's a start. And I think that it's a way of letting people know that this is a common condition and that there are centers and people who can take really good care of them. But I think that starting with that awareness is a really important piece of the puzzle.
Dr. Robert Elder, thank you ever so much for the interview.
Thanks very much, Brian.
And you can find more details about congenital heart defects by visiting yalemedicine.org/departments/adult congenital heart program. It was once said in a song that video killed the radio star, but in recent years, radio and audio content has had somewhat of a renaissance thanks to technology like the internet, smartphones, and speakers like Alexa. In Connecticut, CRIS Radio has been supplying an audio service to the state for many years, and I spoke recently to Diane Weaver-Dunn, the Executive Director of CRIS Radio, to find out more. Diane, thanks for joining us on Generations.
Oh, and thank you so much for including us.
Can you tell us a little bit about CRIS Radio? Because a lot of people may never have heard of you.
I know, and we're always surprised when folks have never heard of us because we've been around for 41 years. And we've been broadcasting for 40 of those 41 years. So we have been around for quite a while. CRIS Radio is actually called Connecticut Radio Information System. And we operate a broadcast center in Windsor, Connecticut, as well as in 5 other studios throughout the state in Danbury, Trumbull, Norwalk, Norwich, and West Haven. And so what we do is we broadcast 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, articles published in newspapers and in magazines. And our the people who tune into us, per se, those folks are people who are either blind, have some type of visual disability, or are unable to read for any other reason. For example, dyslexia, Parkinson's, they can't turn a page, cerebral palsy, or let's say they have a particular medical treatment or a medical condition that prevents them from reading. So we provide audio versions of these articles in more than 50 newspapers and magazines. And that is for our general publication. We also record children's magazines, and we record about 13 of those, and we stream that directly to Connecticut Children's Medical Center.
How has it changed because I think you've been there, just over 6 years now as the Executive Director. How would you say things have changed since you started there?
Sure. Well, time flies. I've been here actually 9 years as of March 6th. And what we've done is we have really embraced new technologies. So back even 10 years ago, nobody had really heard of hands-free speakers, for example, Alexa, or folks primarily were still using those simple cell phones, not smartphones. Now the adoption rate for mobile devices and tablets and internet-related devices have really blossomed. And so what we wanted to do is make sure that we were still relevant to people who wanted to listen to CRIS Radio on the go. So what we did was we created an extensive on-demand audio library of what we broadcast. We actually make available as on-demand podcasts. And so what we've done over the last 9 years is continually embrace new technologies. For example, prior to 9 years ago, we really had not even started to distribute what they call internet radios. So we were not able to provide service to people who were residents of assisted living facilities or nursing homes. Now with internet radios and Wi-Fi readily available in most facilities, we now can provide these internet radios and install them in a common area, and folks can sit around and listen to these articles that are published in a numerous number of magazines and newspapers. So that's just one example. Another example is we're now able to stream to hospitals, to each patient room, through a hospital's in-house TV system. And so we've also, in addition to Connecticut Children's streaming children's magazines, we are now streaming to each patient room at St. Francis Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut, to each patient room through their rack room. And we're streaming 2 streams. One is in English and one is in Spanish language. And we are about to complete 2 other installations, one at Stanford Hospital and one at Mount Sinai Rehabilitation Hospital.
That, again, I mean, is just truly amazing, being able to obviously tap into that audience and using the technology. Tell us a little bit more about, obviously, the Spanish language, because you're probably one of a very few media organizations that does that.
We actually are. We're surprisingly one of the few that offers an extensive lineup of children's magazines and Spanish language magazines. And so right now we are recording about 11 newspapers and magazines that are Spanish language. For example, National Geographic in Spanish, People magazine in Spanish. We also record some Spanish language newspapers that are published here in the States, but are talk about news and events that are happening in South America and the Caribbean. So it is quite unusual for a radio reading service to offer this. In fact, we understand that we are the only organization to run such an extensive lineup of both children's and Spanish language. That's pretty unique.
Now, of course, you do rely on volunteers. So tell us a little bit about your volunteers, you know, where they come from, what they do for you, because I know it's a very large part of your organization.
Absolutely. One thing about CRIS Radio is that we are truly a community-driven nonprofit. We have the fortune of having about 200 volunteers who donate their voice talent and dedicate their time and are very committed to coming in and recording all of these countless numbers of articles. And so our volunteers are located statewide. So we have about 100 volunteers who come in here to the Windsor Broadcast Center. However, we also have about 100 volunteers who go into the regional studios and donate their time as well in those locations. Without these volunteers, we absolutely could not operate. As a matter of fact, if you considered what the voice talent would cost us, this would be well over a $1 million operation, and we're able to do that on half that amount for the electricity, the costs, by depending on volunteers and their tremendous voice talent.
I think what's interesting, obviously, about your service, I mean, and there are so many interesting things about the service, is audio always seems to have a bit of a renaissance. We talk about radio having a renaissance, and now, of course, things like podcasting has once again sort of like put audio at the forefront of things. Do you feel fortunate that you are part of this part of the industry which is almost constantly reinventing itself?
Absolutely. Well, what we realized too is that we could provide so much in audio because we have a state-of-the-art radio station here in Windsor, that we could leverage the talent of our volunteers and leverage the equipment by providing more access to underserved people in the community. And one example of doing that, and part of maybe it would be considered a renaissance, is we're able to provide talking exhibits at museums for a very low cost. But what we're doing is not only are we making it accessible to more people with disabilities who otherwise might not even visit a museum, we're also providing more audio information for typical visitors. So it's just been really an outstanding project for us, because now we've installed these talking exhibits in 8 museums, and they're not the old-fashioned audio tours per se, like, you know, back in the day you'd carry on this big headset. Nowadays what people can do, and what we've done, is we've designed a program where you use your smartphone, you can scan a QR code next to the exhibit, and you will receive a very short and sweet audio description of the exhibit, information about the exhibit, and whether or not there's tactile opportunities where you could touch and feel the exhibit. So not only are we enhancing the ability for people who are blind or have some type of print disability to enjoy that experience, we're really hoping that we are able to increase the number of museum visitors by offering and improving accessibility for them. The World War I project was absolutely so enlightening and so fascinating, because we were able to get primary source documents collected by the state library and record them here. And now the National Archives has retained all of these podcasts, basically, and these audio recordings of these historic documents, so that they're more accessible to people who would otherwise be unable to read them. And of course, these are all handwritten documents that we transcribed and we recorded. So that was an incredibly unique project.
You've been going, as you say, for many, many years. You know, you've eclipsed probably many other media organisations that have come and gone, which just goes to show how relevant and successful clearly you are. What do you see as the future as you go forward?
Well, what I see for the future is something that we've already started developing and continuing to evolve, is our mobile apps. We have a CRIS Radio mobile app, so people no longer need to sit next to a transistor radio and listen to CRIS Radio. They can listen to the news and information, you know, at a doctor's office with their earbuds. They can listen to it in the car. So we're finding that also the on-demand component and making it available on a mobile device, that is really become rather powerful for people who we serve. But we've also found that the future is leveraging what we do, and we are in the process of developing a second mobile app, and this is for the CRIS Access, the museum program, for the to include wayfinding potentially. And one of the this component of this CRIS Access app is to include GPS functionality, so that a longitude and latitude will actually trigger the recording if you are at an outdoor exhibit, for example, like at Mystic Seaport, or at an accessible playground, and as you're getting close and approaching a piece of equipment, the audio recording will say, well, you are now getting near the swing set, and the accessible swings are to your left. That type of information. So we're trying to really add more functionality within the community with what we're doing.
Diane, it all sounds absolutely incredible. Thank you ever so much for joining us on Generations.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity.
And Diane wanted us to let you know they have a technology resource guide available on their website with everything you need to know about how to use your Alexa or other smart devices. And the internet radios she mentioned in the interview are available from CRIS Radio at no charge. Details can be found at CRIS, that's CRIS radio.org. Joining us as usual for Generations is Judy Jenks from seniorcenterct.org. Judy, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, as always.
We've got a really interesting subject, not that you don't do interesting subjects usually, but it's a reflections of who we used to be. Explain more.
Time has a way of passing much faster than we realize. I think whoever they are, steal time as we sleep, because where else does it go? Haven't you been shocked when you look in the mirror and see how much time has passed? Or looked at your children and been surprised how many years have flown by? And it doesn't seem possible for all those years to have gone by. If you close your eyes and you look at yourself as you feel you are, you're much younger than that darn mirror tells you. Recently, I came across photographer Tom Hussey's work, Reflections, which shows elderly people looking in the mirror and seeing who they were many years before. Perhaps they were a fireman, a nurse, the scholar, the pharmacist, a new mother, a welder. Reflections was inspired by a World War II veteran who said, "I can't believe I'm going to be 80. I feel like I just came back from the war. I look in the mirror and I see this old guy." It brings to mind that with retirement and age, we lose a big part of our identity. As we enter adulthood, we're often asked, "What do you want to be?" But seldom after we retire are we asked, "So what did you used to be? Who were you before?" We have been a big part, the aging community has been a big part of building our cities and our towns. We have served in many positions, be it elected or volunteer. We have been the scout leaders, the umpire, the coaches, the committee member. And for those of us who feel we might be losing our identity, let's share the stories of our past, volunteer to teach others, once again become that committee member, volunteer at the local school, the senior center, the hospital, continue to be an active part of the community. And for those who haven't reached those later years, the next time you encounter the elders of your community, be it at the grocery store, your place of business, or just in passing, take a few minutes to find out more about who they are and who they were. You'll be surprised just who you're talking to.
That's very true, and a very poignant sort of like piece, I think, because we live in this age where things have just become so progressively faster and we don't even seem to have time for ourselves because of the way that modern life is. It's a really interesting thing that he's created there, and obviously has struck a chord with you.
Yes, at one point in my life, I was a volunteer EMT in my town, and I went to this ambulance call, and I'm going to keep this story short, but as we're, the guy wasn't, critically ill, so there was time for conversation. And as we were riding in the ambulance to the hospital, he had a very heavy accent, and for whatever reason, I asked him how he ended up in the community that we were in. And he told me the story of being a merchant marine, and he and his wife had come to this country from over sort of where Poland is, and they were living in New York City. She decided she was all done living in the city, and she found a farm, and she was buying the farm and taking the kids, and he could either go or not go. And he decided to go. And as the conversation progressed, he said to me, he says, my nephew. And I didn't recognize his last name, so I didn't know who his nephew was. And he kept insisting I knew his nephew. So finally I was like, I don't really know who your nephew is. Who is your nephew? Thinking, he was a local personality in our area. His nephew turned out to be the ruler of the country he was from. And it was like, wow, I do know who your nephew is because I read about him in the newspaper. So you really, truly never know who you're talking to.
Yeah, that is amazing, isn't it?
Yes.
Judy, as always, it's a pleasure talking to you, and we'll catch up with you in the next episode.
Okay, take care.
That's all from this edition of Generations. Don't forget to visit seniorcenterct.org to find out what's going on in your neck of the woods. And if you want to send us a topic to talk about or want to be our guest on the podcast, drop us a line by visiting the seniorcenterct.org website. Go to the bottom of the homepage and click the How to Advertise with Us link to get in touch. From myself, Brian Scott Smith, thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.